I thought I'd share some reflections today about the differences of living in northern Thailand and living in my home country, which is New Zealand. Or I guess you can apply this to living in another country like Australia or Canada, particularly Western countries that are quite a lot different in so many ways than living in northern Thailand. One of the key things that I notice here is that life is generally pretty relaxed in the north, and this is one of the things that I find most attractive about it. It's also a little bit unpredictable, a little bit more unpredictable than, say, life back in New Zealand is, because particularly when I go out, I'm never sure what I'm going to see out in the street or on my way or down at the market or wherever I'm going. Life tends to be a little bit more, not really haphazard, but just unpredictable. And I think this tends to be reflected in the nature of the people, that they're a lot more chill and relaxed and open to things changing, and you've got to have a bit of wiggle room. I find that if I'm getting a bit anxious about something, I've just got to stop and take stock of what I'm understanding and why I'm understanding it, and realize most of the time it is just a bit of a misunderstanding. And if I think about it differently, if I think about it from a more Thai perspective, then I can understand things better and get on a lot more easily in life. And I really do like that aspect about living here, is that it is more chill, that it is more flexible, there's more wiggle room, and it appears sometimes to a lot of Westerners, and I know a lot of Westerners that get kind of upset with the Thai sabai, the relaxed way of doing things, but I actually really love it and really find that in communications with people out and about are a lot more pleasant, and just a lot more. It's quite common that every transaction that you do here, maybe not so much at a grocery store or at a 7-Eleven, but certainly at the market, you're going to have a conversation with the person that you're buying something from. A little bit of chit chat about the weather or about where I'm from or how long I've been here, little things like that. I've just been down to our Sunday market. It's a huge, sprawling rural market here that happens every Sunday morning. Has been happening for over 100 years apparently in the same place, and it's just quite delightful. I love going down there. I always try not to be in a hurry. I didn't have as much time as I'd like to this morning, but still had time for some good conversations. I bought some vegetable seedlings and chatted to the people about those and what am I planting and what my garden was like. I bought some hand tools. This guy's got a fabulous selection of bits and pieces of tools that he imports from Japan, and he just sells them by weight. So buying some sorts of tools is pretty cheap, particularly if you're not buying a mallet. But buying a saw or a couple of wood planes, I managed to pick up some real bargains this morning, but had a really lovely conversation with the vendor in the process. He's a guy that I've talked to before. I speak in English with him because he speaks a bit of English and he enjoys doing that. But with others, I'll just, chat about where I live and what I'm doing. It's good practice for my Thai language because most of them down there don't speak any English. And it's just, it's really relaxed and a really enjoyable time. And even in bigger stores, I'll go into places and always anticipate some sort of conversation if I'm open to it. If I'm in a bit of a hurry, no, you don't need to, but it's just something that's, I do really enjoy about living in northern Thailand, is that there's often a little bit more connection, a little bit more conversation with people than, say, when I'm back in New Zealand. And I was back in New Zealand earlier this year, and it was something that I'd kind of anticipated, because when I'm walking in the street, I'll smile and nod at people. It's common here. It's not as a strange thing as it might be in the West, particularly in the big cities and that. And so I was kind of thinking about that. I was a bit aware of it, trying to remember not to make eye contact and smile with people because they might think you're a bit weird or a bit bonkers or something back in New Zealand. But I was really pleasantly surprised as I walked in Ashburton, which is a small town in the South Island of New Zealand, that people did make eye contact and smile, and I was able to return with a nod and a smile and say good morning, and I found that really nice. It was lovely. So I guess it depends a lot too where you are. I'm not sure about Bangkok or some of the bigger, busier places. Maybe people are a bit more reserved or a bit more guarded, and they wouldn't be so friendly. But certainly up in the north, and certainly in the smaller places and places like rural markets, people are going to be more relaxed and generally more conversational with you if you want to. And that's something I really do enjoy about living in the north of Thailand. I find here in Thailand that people have quite a different way of thinking. The Eastern mindset is quite different than most Western mindset is. In a lot of ways, it seems to be more open to unpredictability and change, whereas in the West, things are a lot more black and white. We like to know what is right and what is wrong, or what we think is right and wrong, or what is best. And these things aren't so fixed in Thailand and the Thai way of thinking. It seems to be a bit more flexible, a bit more open to really taking a different perspective than just a black and a white. There's a lot more grey area, and this in a way can make life very interesting. Sometimes it makes it very, very difficult. I had a very strange experience when we were buying the land. We'd already bought the land here, and the surveyors were coming from the local government, and we were to get together with the neighbours on either side of us and figure out where the boundaries were. We'd already purchased the land, and so this is extremely different. There's a lot more flexibility in the whole process than there is, say, back in New Zealand, where if we bought a piece of land in New Zealand, you know exactly what you're buying before you pay any money. Whereas here, it was just a matter of figuring it out with the neighbour. Our neighbour on one side, the electricity company had already come in. We got them to put a power pole in. We had discovered that it was actually on our neighbour's land. So during this process of the discussion, we just tweaked the marking pegs a little bit so that the power pole was now on our land, and we swung the boundary a little bit in our neighbour's favour further down, and nothing was a problem. So this is quite a different way of thinking about something that in New Zealand is very strict and very black and white. This is the land that you've purchased, whereas here it was kind of decided later with conversation about it with our neighbours and with the local government officials. So things are quite different in some respects, and sometimes it's better than others. This took me a little bit to get my head around, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter at all. And so this was just a good way of doing it, where there's been no boundary markers before. Why not sit down with your neighbours and the local government and figure out where you want them to be? Really, there's no difficulty in it whatsoever if everybody gets on, and it's good for a relationship and it's just good for life. In northern Thailand here, the culture and traditions are a lot older and a lot more deeply entrenched into the people. In New Zealand, this is quite different because it's such a young country, and the culture and traditions are not so deeply developed, not so broadly reaching into the psyche of people and into the way people do things as they are here in Thailand. And the more I learn about and try and understand the Thai culture, the more fascinating I find it. I find it really quite amazing that there is such a richness and such a depth. And quite often when I've done photo workshops, I've worked with Thai dancers and Thai performers who are trained in the traditional way of dance and storytelling and even music and playing musical instruments, and then all the costuming, and often these characters that these people are portraying are actors, they're people in stories that are depicting the depth of the culture in the past. And every little detail is nuanced and special down to the finest things and the most intricate things. And sometimes regular Thai people who haven't studied these things are not aware of even how deep their own culture and own tradition is, but it is really ingrained. It's really part of the subconsciousness of Thai people, the tradition and the way they do things. And this is just, one small example of how deeply entrenched the culture is, right into the food, in the language, and the way people communicate with each other, and then certainly in the arts and music and storytelling and painting and all manner of different things. There's a depth and a richness in the culture. And sure, like any culture, it changes, it's morphing, it's changing, it's becoming more westernized in a lot of ways. It's not altering the old culture, it's not altering the past, but Thai people are becoming more westernized and even affected by other Eastern cultures. I know that the Korean culture and particularly Korean music and dare I say it, Korean soap operas and that are very, very popular here. And this is having some influence on the young culture and the modern culture here. So it's quite different. But we get that in New Zealand as well. We get influence from all over the world in our country, and we're quite used to that because we're such a young culture that it's not uncommon for people to take on some part of their ancestral culture and ways of doing things because it's just human nature. But in Thailand, in the north of Thailand, in the Lana culture, the northern Thai culture, this is something that has been handed down for generation upon generation upon generation. And this is quite different than it is in New Zealand, where we're just much more of a melting pot of a whole lot of different cultures. Whereas in Thailand, in the north, particularly here, it's noticeable that the northern Thai, the Lana culture is very deep and very strong, and the traditions are rich and wonderful. And it is something that I really do love about living in Thailand. Another really big difference between living in New Zealand and living in Thailand is the weather. The weather here is usually pretty hot. It's pretty warm most of the year. And in our winter time, which is the same as the New Zealand summertime, the temperatures are similar. So now we're coming into November. So through November, December, January, this is summertime in New Zealand where the weather's quite warm, it's quite pleasant. It doesn't usually go over 30 degrees Celsius. But here in the northern part of Thailand, in the daytime, it's usually going to be 30 degrees or above in the cool season. So this is the same months as the summertime in New Zealand. And then during the hot season, sometimes during the evening or during the early morning, it could get down to single digits. The coolest that I've measured the temperature here was 7 degrees Celsius one morning, which is getting pretty chilly. In the mornings in the winter time when I go out for a bike ride, I've got track pants on, I've got long sleeves on because it's just a little bit too cool. It'll be maybe 15, 16 degrees Celsius quite frequently. But then coming out of that, we move into the hot season in Thailand. So March, April, May, before it rains, before the monsoons come, it'll be getting over 40 degrees Celsius in the daytime. It's hot and dry and pretty oppressive. I like to be inside in the middle of the day with the air conditioning turned on. And then usually sometime around May or June, it starts to rain and it just can get progressively heavier through July, August, September. This year it's lasted right through into October. It doesn't rain all the time, but it rains, pretty much every day for 20 minutes sometimes an hour or two, but then other times it'll rain just steadily all day. And this is the most wonderful time, the most wonderful season because it's when the rice is growing. And the rice season here is just magnificent. I love it. This is our neighbour's land. This is our view during the rice season. We just look out across this. So it's getting pretty ripe now. It's turning quite yellow. But as we progress, as the beginning of the season happens and the rice is still young, it's a deeper colour green. And as it grows, it changes and the whole landscape morphs and changes until it gets to this stage. And a little bit longer, they'll be harvesting it. But it is such a richness in the seasonal life. A lot of people avoid travelling to Thailand and travelling in Thailand during the rainy season, but I find it is the most wonderful time to travel and to get about because the countryside is looking so lush and so beautiful. November, I think, is the best weather. It's still warm, it gets a little bit cooler in the evenings, but before the rice is harvested, the whole countryside looks magnificent. The forests are lush and green. You get some fabulous skies with big fluffy clouds, but not often too much rain. And it's just very, very pleasant time of the year to be out and enjoying life in northern Thailand. And this is so different than in New Zealand. People often ask me, when's the raining season in New Zealand? And I sort of joke and laugh and say, well, it starts in January and it goes right through to December. You can never really pick when it's going to rain. Some months are going to be wetter than others, but you can get rain anytime in New Zealand. It's a small country that's surrounded by the ocean, and so the weather is generally pretty unpredictable. And it certainly never gets as hot as it does in Thailand, but here it definitely doesn't get as cold as it does in some parts of New Zealand, particularly in the South Island or places where you're at altitude. And living in Thailand, yeah, it's been an adjustment to get used to the hotter temperatures. Still not sure if I'm really can say that I'm used to the really hot temperatures that we get in April and May, but I prefer it by far over the cold, damp days that we used to get when I lived in Auckland and other places in New Zealand. People often ask, how do I get on driving in Thailand? Is it quite different? And it is, we drive on the same side of the road in New Zealand, but that's about the only similarity to driving in Thailand. And I have driven longer here, I've realised, than I have done in New Zealand. I've been here for 21 years and I didn't drive for that long when I was in New Zealand. I got my licence, I think, when I was about 19. So I only drove for about 17 or 18 years in New Zealand. And I'm quite used to driving in Thailand now. It is quite different. There's a lot more wiggle room, as there is with a lot of things in Thailand. And it is just, yeah, there's not so many hard and fast rules, and there's certainly not the amount of law enforcement out on the streets. Usually the only time that you see police out in the streets here is if they're attending an accident, a wreck or something, or if they've got roadblocks that they're testing for alcohol consumption, drinking, driving, or more likely, more often than ever, they are stopping motorcyclists and cars and stuff around in the centre of Chiang Mai, checking to see if people have got a licence, checking to see if motorcyclists are wearing a helmet, seeing if the car registration's up to date, certain things like that. So basically revenue collecting. Whereas in New Zealand, there's a lot more active law enforcement. You've got to be a lot more careful, because if you break the rules, you're going to get fined, and those fines are pretty tough. There are more speed cameras here now, but some of the times I don't think they work particularly well. There's one on the way up the mountain here that has got a big tree growing in front of it, so not sure how effective that one is. But certainly in New Zealand, there's a lot more of that electronic surveillance that is keeping tabs on people and sending them letters in the post with a big bill attached to them. It doesn't sort of happen so much here. The other thing about transport here too is that there are lots more motorcycles. Motorcycles or motor scooters are a very, very easy way. They're a cheap way to get around and a very convenient. They're cheap to run, and so many people have got motorcycles here. Many households have got one or more motorcycles, and it is so common on the road to see motorcycles virtually everywhere. Anytime, certainly you pull up at a set of stoplights, there's going to be motorcycles pulling alongside or out in front of you, and there's just a big group, particularly around universities, around school, during the time where schools are getting out. I avoid these like the plague, because you've got a lot of teenagers on motorcycles. And yeah, it's just a bit of a dodgy mix, because they just tend to flow like water does. They just find the easiest path to get through the traffic and go on their way. Another big difference in Thailand is the style of public transport, particularly in the cities. You've got a lot more taxi trucks in Chiang Mai, or BART buses they call them some places of Thailand, and it's basically a pickup truck with a couple of seats in the back. It's covered, and some of them will follow like a bus route. Others will be more freelance like a taxi, but they're a shared taxi. So you might be going in one direction, you can hop on, ask the driver, and he'll take you there, but he'll stop for other customers along the way. So it's a pretty cheap way of getting around. There are some buses in Chiang Mai, and surely in Bangkok you've got the buses, and you've got train services and underground and overground trains. So that's a very comprehensive transport network. Also now, of course, there's ride sharing, that you can book a vehicle via an app on your phone, things like that. So, and long distance transport, a lot of people travel by bus or by train, and even internal flights in Thailand with cut price airlines these days, it's pretty cheap and pretty easy to get around. So a lot of people fly rather than take the time for the bus or the train. And if I've got time, yeah, I do like to take the train. It's been a while now, but I've done the Chiang Mai Bangkok train trip a number of times. Other times getting around to places I've flown, usually between bigger cities, but also sometimes in smaller aircraft. One time going up to Mae Hong Son, which is way up in the north in the mountains, and that was pretty interesting. But yeah, generally getting around Thailand, getting around the cities when you're in Thailand is pretty easy. And yeah, driving here is not too difficult. You've just got to remember to be slow and careful and polite. And this is still something I struggle with. Sometimes I get a bit frustrated with drivers that seem to be totally unaware that there's anybody else using the road, but it doesn't change. So there's no point in getting too upset about it, no point in getting upset about it at all, because it just is the way things happen here. And one of the other big differences here, living in the north of Thailand, particularly now that we live in a rural area, is that life is cheaper. It's not so expensive to live here. The house that we live in, we've designed it and built it, we bought the piece of land. There's no way that I could live like this on the same money in New Zealand. It just wouldn't be possible. So buying the land was cheap, building the house was cheap in comparison to a house that I owned in New Zealand, which was probably on an eighth of the size of the land, and the house would have been maybe a third of the size of the house, or even smaller than what we've got, and certainly not the high level of construction quality that we've got on the house here. Sure, it was maybe 20, 25 years earlier, but we paid roughly the same price for building this house and buying the land as I'd paid for a small, insignificant little house on a dot of a section and just a cheap suburb that was all we could afford in New Zealand. So here, okay, we're rural, and anywhere in the world, if you go rural, usually the price of land is cheaper. But here it is just so much cheaper to be able to buy land and build a house than it is in New Zealand. And even if you're renting in the local area around here, or if you're renting in the cities, it's a lot cheaper paying per month than it would be if you were paying per month in a country like New Zealand. And then that spreads out too. It's not just the housing that's cheaper. Pretty much everything that is regularly used by Thai people is cheaper. So going to the markets and buying fresh food is so much cheaper. Buying food in New Zealand at the supermarkets, when I was there, I was just amazed at how expensive things are, and friends and family in New Zealand often telling me, wow, you pay so much for a head of cabbage or a lettuce or a block of cheese that it's very expensive to buy food, to buy fresh food. And it can be here too if you're buying what we call foreign food, which is foreign food. Say, for example, buying a block of cheese, that's still quite expensive because it's not really part of the Thai diet. It's more of a foreign food. It's an imported food quite often, or it's a specialty food. But if you're buying anything for fruit or vegetables that are grown locally, that are produced locally, or chicken or pork, beef is a little bit more expensive because the Thai people generally don't eat it so much. So if you particularly want good beef, then you're going to be buying imported beef, and that's expensive. So I tend not to eat so much of that. Any locally produced food that is generally consumed by Thai people is going to be relatively inexpensive. And then as are things like the electricity and water supply, the internet connections, things like that are all generally a bit cheaper than they are back home. And some other things, like buying a vehicle, is quite a lot more expensive, whether you're buying a new car or a second-hand car or truck. These are generally quite a lot more expensive than they are, particularly second-hand. I find the prices are a lot more inflated than if I was buying a second-hand vehicle in New Zealand. One of the things that I love is a lot cheaper here is going out to eat. Sure, in the big cities you can go to expensive restaurants and pay a lot for your meal, but if you go local, if you're buying Thai food, you can get fantastic meals for a really, really cheap price. Last night, my wife and I went out. We tried a new little place. It was just side of the road place, but it was cool. It was really quite funky. It was quite chic and comfortable, very chill atmosphere, very relaxed. The food was fantastic. We had, I think, 3 pork dishes, lap and sar, and another one, I'm not sure, and some French fries. We thought, oh, I'll try the French fries. That were absolutely fantastic, by the way, and a couple of packs of sticky rice and some beers, and it came to the equivalent of about $20 for both of us to feel quite full and quite comfortable and very relaxed. So an evening out like that for $20, $25 is really hard to beat. And comparing this to when I was traveling in New Zealand recently, wow, eating out quite often would stop at a little cafe or something like that for lunch, and just lunch, a simple lunch with a coffee, was going to come to twice that price, $40 or $50 easily for two of us. So there's a few reflections on how I find life in the north of Thailand to be quite different than life in New Zealand. If you've enjoyed this, please let us know. If you've got questions or if you've got anything to add, drop a note in the comments below and share your thoughts. I'd be interested to know. Thanks for watching.